businesses. So on to the main bulk of today's session. Last week we heard from Anne Miller. She covered the fundamentals of net zero and how to understand your business's carbon emissions. In case you missed it, all that content is up on our website. And this week we'll be building on that, and we'll explore the question, where do I start when making carbon reduction decisions? And it's got a particular focus on energy efficient decisions and low carbon technologies. Running today's session, we've got Senior Environmental Consultant David Knight from PECT and Invest Environment. David worked with businesses in a consultant role and a particular focus on energy and carbon. So I'll now pass you on to David so he can take you through today's session. You're on mute, David.
One day we'll get this right. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, thank you very much for having me. So, and thanks to Jasmine as well for the introduction. So just to make sure we can go through slides, which we can. Brilliant. So yes, so my name is David Knight. I am a senior environmental consultant at PECT and Investors in the Environment. Just a bit about myself. So I've been working as a consultant now for over 7 years, but I have been in the environmental sector with Investors in the Environment for over 10 years. My main focus is energy and carbon, and I'm a very keen advocate of installing the right technology in the right place, which is kind of what we want to look at covering in today's session. So just a quick overview in terms of what we're going to be covering today, but the main aim of today is to help explain the need for efficiency and how technology forms part of that. So we'll briefly discuss the challenge of energy in the UK, and the importance of energy management and how that will help you inform you which technology you consider when planning your future actions. So first, the challenge is for me to get all of this done in an hour, so we'll get as quick as we can. But I like the phrase, just like the phrase, energy is the cause of and the solution to all of our problems from a carbon perspective. I mean, every day we consume energy in one form or another, and the continued use of energies is having a significant impact on our environment. The challenge, however, is that our way of life and the infrastructure is now so heavily dependent on energy, we just can't remove it. So we have to now look at how we create it and look at how we use it in order to balance the impact that it's having. So if we look at the current electricity mix, it's generated by a variety of sources. However, the largest single contributor is still gas. So if we look at 2019, over 300 terawatt hours of electricity was generated, and that mix was provided by 40% from renewables, 40% from gas, and the remaining 20% coming from things like nuclear and other sources. So we are continuing to shift towards renewables, particularly wind, as well as solar and hydro. And these sources will help to generate electricity without the need for fossil fuels. I mean, in the UK particularly, wind is of particular notice because it has such a great potential over sunshine. The main problem, however, is the shift of heating, and not just heating for properties, but also the heat needed for industrial processes. UK's heat is predominantly provided by gas. So when we look at the whole energy mix, natural gas makes up over 90% of the UK's heating and electrical demand. So when we actually contrast then, looking at gas, the total consumption for heating and processes was over 800 terawatt hours. That's 3 times larger than that for electricity. And we also have to consider that 40% of that electricity actually comes from gas as well. So this is the most significant challenge for the UK. How do we generate the same levels of energy without using gas? Now, we can obviously switch electric heating switch to electric heating. But if we were to switch all of our heating to electric, we just further compound the existing problem with the already struggling electric system. Plus, in order to do that, we have to vastly increase the amount of renewables we have to actually balance and actually take on the additional load. So hydrogen is obviously one solution that's currently being looked at in terms of tackling heating, particularly within industry where you have high heat demands for processes. Renewables is obviously another source. The problems with renewables, so solar only performs well in summer. It's not great at winter. So we do look at wind. Now, wind is fantastic all year round, but particularly in winter. However, it's also sporadic because we don't have wind all of the time. So as we can see with the challenge, there isn't a single solution to the overall problem. We have to look at a wide different range of technologies in order to meet the challenge and create the energy that we need. And we can see this actually evidenced within the 10-point plan that's been provided by the government, 10 different solutions working towards the same problem. So the key part to the challenge for businesses and us as individuals is just the amount of energy required. So really, for us to tackle this problem, we have to tackle how much energy we are using in the first instance. And this is where efficiency is important. So while technology is great, we really have to look at our own efficiencies and to try and minimize the amount of energy we use in the first instance to actually support the overall challenge we have across the UK. So that's the challenge the UK faces. And again, it mirrors the challenge for business. So electricity demand will grow. Heat is problematic, as is transport. And the latter two actually make up the biggest parts of most SMEs' carbon footprint. If we exclude the value chain, the scope 3 type stuff, if we look at just business emissions, we'll find energy is one of the largest sources of carbon emissions for most businesses. Now, the fundamental to energy or resource efficiency, and as well as reducing costs associated to it, is actually how we manage that. And to manage any resource, you must measure it. Importantly to it, so when you are measuring your resources, you also have to start to understand how you are using the energy and why it is being used in that way. And that forms part of the overall management. So first of all, actually measuring what you're using and understanding how much of it you're using. Then start to think about, well, how are we actually using it? What are we using within our business? And then think about, well, why are we doing it that way? Is there a way that we can improve it? How can we make it better? And that forms part of energy management and environmental management overall. So the key thing from the actual slide itself is technology needs to match what is possible, not what is needed. Yeah, we can't replace behavior with technology. We need to use technology to support the behavior. So really working with staff and thinking about the behaviors on site is vital when looking at and actually planning what you do around your energy management. So working with many organizations, one key aspect that comes up is first of all, understanding energy consumption in the first place. And to do that is actually understanding energy bills. So, you know, with a lot of businesses that we work with and we go to site with, you know, we ask them for energy data and sometimes it can be a bit, they're not quite sure what they're sending or what they need to get for us. So first thing I'll say to all businesses is get to know your energy bills, understand it. What do you know what it's telling you? Do you know what the information it's giving you is providing? And there's some useful sources on there that you can go to, which will actually help you break down what a bill tells you. The second thing as well is record the data. So, you know, understanding your energy bills is one thing, but actually recording that separately in a place where you can go back and look over it is again vital as well. So when you're looking at energy, you also need to compare it against what you're doing as a business. So how much energy you're using is, you know, measuring it is fine, but then comparing it to what am I doing on site, and do I believe that the amount of energy I'm using matches what I'm actually doing as an activity? And that could be looking at how many hours I'm operating, what kind of activities are we doing. And if you do have half-hourly data, you know, as a consultant, as far as I'm concerned, that stuff is gold dust. If you can get half-hourly data, or you do have half-hourly data, make sure you're using it as much as you can. Now, just as an example, so here's some examples of output. So when you actually capture and record your data, what you can then do with it is make it visual. So, you know, looking at numbers is, you know, fine. For someone like myself, it's absolutely great, but being able to portray in a visual aspect makes it, when you're assessing it, a lot easier. So just in terms of the information here, sorry if I can get to it. So these two graphs here are half-hourly data, as is this what we call a heat map. So as you can see with half-hourly, I can actually look at every half an hour how much energy I'm using. So very quickly within this, if we look at the heat map, I can see here in this business at 2 o'clock in the morning. So again, they're not open. They only open between, in this case, it was 6:30 till 6 at night. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, something's switching on. So we can see that within the data immediately by looking at it, by going through this process, we can immediately see something's not working, something's not right. So we know that we actually found out that there was a timer, a faulty timer that was switching on some of the systems at 2 o'clock in the morning and was able to then reduce that energy. Now, for most businesses who just have standard energy utility bills and meters, you know, you'll be able to present the information like this. So we have gas, this is a quarterly bill. So as you can see, we've just averaged out the quarter over the months. And here we can see a typical winter heating demand, summer lull. And for electricity, again, we see a fairly consistent. I mean, ideally, you want this to be as consistent as possible. And then again, with a winter increase. Again, looking at this, I would say, well, why is December so high compared to January, considering it's the same season, really? So it's just understanding what happened in December as to why that use is so high. Gas particularly, yes, we have a winter high and a summer low, but even at summer, it's still quite high. So I'd also be looking at why is our gas use in summer so high, and what is it that's actually happening on site that's causing that to be higher than we expect. So again, capturing the information is absolutely vital, but using that information to help make decisions and understand what's happening on site is absolutely fundamental and really necessary. Before you start to look at technology, before you consider what technology you put in place, you need to know what's happening first and then choose the technology that best meets what you need. So just carrying on with some additional energy management. So one thing that we see a lot of times is we refer to it as a vampire load. So this is for businesses who have a day rate and a night rate, you're able to actually look at how much energy you consume in night rate. Now, night rate is midnight till 7 in the morning. So 99% of businesses won't be operational between midnight and 7 in the morning. However, what we find with a lot of energy bills is up to 25% of your total energy consumption happens during these 7 hours. Now that's just 7 hours. If you actually then say, well, you shut down at say 6 o'clock at night and you don't open until 8 o'clock the next morning, when you actually extrapolate that, we actually find that 30 to 40% of the energy consumption happens when you're not even in the business. So the idea is to think about, well, what is happening? What is our shutdown procedure? Are we switching everything off? What's being left on? Now, we do expect energy to be consumed outside of work. You know, there's security systems that run in the background, there's digital systems that run in the background, and some of these need to run and can't be switched off, particularly if you're trying to remote access, that kind of thing. But there's still a lot of things being plugged in and just left on. Occasionally lights being left on an error, or air conditioning systems being left on an error. So it's really important to actually look at the site, understand what systems are using it, and then think about when we shut down at the end of the night, are we turning everything off that we can and only leaving on what's necessary? So we've seen some businesses go through this and they were able to actually bring their entire outside of work operation down to around 18%. Now that was absolute best practice. If you can get it to that amount, that's fantastic. That works out to about 12% as a night rate. But for average businesses, we would expect it to be around about 15 to 18% ideally. But if it's above 20%, then it's definitely something to look at and to see if you can minimize that in any way. So the other thing is just around sort of timers, temperatures. So with heating systems, so heating is generally problematic for most organizations. And what we tend to have is our heating system on a timer. What I find traditionally with timers is they get set and then forgotten about. So just be aware that your timers do need to be looked at least annually. You know, obviously during the heating season, probably I would say at least twice throughout the heating season. And it's just to make sure that your heating times match your building's use. So how quickly does your building heat up? How late can you turn your heating system on? So we've seen buildings that turn their heating system on 2 hours before anyone even walks in the door. Again, that's unnecessary because they can actually heat the building within 45 minutes. So timing your heating, how fast does it heat? How quickly does it cool down? So when can I turn my heating system off at the end of the day? Again, if you're leaving at 5, most businesses can turn it off at 4. So for that last hour, you just allow the building to naturally cool. That helps people get out of the building as well. But again, it's just really thinking about, well, how are we managing our heating system? What are the timers and do they actually work, which is really important. The other thing as well is that what we tend to find across most businesses is that not every room requires the same amount of heat. So again, if you have zonal heating and that's something that you are able to do, so you have thermostats around the building, then are your thermostats in sensible places? Are they measuring the temperatures correctly? Do you have equipment underneath them? Or are they, I mean, again, I've seen thermostats for one room located in a second room. So again, making sure that the thermostats are in the right place and they're doing the jobs they need to. For businesses who have central heating systems, I would recommend thermometers or room temperature, whatever you want to use, basically anything that can measure the room itself. And what I would suggest at the beginning of the heating season, at the end of and halfway through the heating season, turn your heating on with your room thermometers in place and go around and just look in each of the rooms and then adjust the TRVs, the thermostat radiator valves, to actually balance the temperature to what you need it to be. The benefit to this is if someone says it's cold, you can use the thermometer to say, well, actually, is it cold and do we need to turn the heating up? But it's rather than turning the whole system up, might just need to adjust the room. So it actually allows you to control the heating need as it's required across each of the individual rooms. And by using thermometers, it's a cheaper way of doing it than actually investing in a fully controlled system. Although we do recommend that, it's just not always feasible for everybody to do that as well. So on the right hand side, just to explain, so CIBSE, so the Chartered Institute of Building Services and Engineering, they've produced this guide, which gives a recommendation to the heating range that you would ideally look to set depending on the type of business and the type of area it is. So what we always recommend is try and go for the lowest temperature. So if you look at a general office or open plan is 21 to 23, so try and go for 21, but you might find that staff, some staff might not necessarily enjoy it, they'd prefer it to be a bit warmer. So again, go to 22 and then go to 23. In 10 years of doing this, I have never yet found a business that has got heating right for everybody. There are always going to be complaints. Unfortunately, it's just the way it is. We're not all thermically the same. So some of us are colder, some of us are warmer. Sometimes it's a case of actually just, you have to try and meet this heating system for the majority and just work with the minority. I know it's, in today's world, it's a bit crazy to say that, but we can't always allow, there's always going to be someone who's not happy with it overall. It might be a case of actually changing the seating plan. So if someone's colder, don't put them next to a window or a door, try and put them more centrally. But as much as possible, try and really think about your temperatures, because every degree you go up is about 8% of your energy costs. So try and keep that temperature as low as you can. Where are we? Okay, so that's sort of energy management overall. Again, the key to understanding, what kind of energy you're having, how you're using it, and then just some simple things to think about within the building itself, just in terms of how it's being managed. That should hopefully allow you to at least have a good foundation. So what we're going to look at now is just the rest of the technologies. But first and foremost, building fabric. Now, there's a term out there that says fabric first approach. So the idea is that if your building is well insulated, and the better insulation you have, the smaller the amount of energy you need to put into it. So we've all heard of passive house, hopefully. So passive house is kind of like the exemplar standard for insulation. The amount of heat that's needed in a passive house is something like 70% lower than the amount of heat needed in the average insulated building. So yes, the more you can wrap your building up in insulation, the better it will perform, the least amount of energy you'll need in terms of actually heating it. However, it's not a cheap option. Insulation is very costly. It also has very long paybacks for most businesses. There's also the challenge that not a lot of SMEs actually own their buildings outright. So for those who lease or rent their properties, these sort of options don't necessarily work for them because it's too big a cost. You don't own the building, and therefore the paybacks won't necessarily meet your lease terms. I mean, if you're only leasing it for 10 years and it's a 30-year payback, it's never going to work financially for you. However, there are regulations that are coming out. So the MEES regulation, which is the minimum energy efficiency standards, these are changing. So as of April 23, all rented properties have to achieve an EPC level of E and above. And that will then be reviewed again so that by 2027, it's C and above. And then with the idea that by 2030, it's B and above. So landlords are now being, I guess, required to actually look at buildings and to look at how they can improve the efficiency. So even if you rent or lease your building, there is light at the end of the tunnel. This is something that is being pushed down to building owners, that they will need to start to take these things into account as well. If you're not sure how your building performs, or if you own your building, you can get an EPC, so that's an energy performance certificate conducted. They are at cost, and that cost can vary depending on how detailed you want the report, but very, very useful things to have done. So what an EPC assessor will do is they'll come down, they'll look at your buildings, they'll understand the insulation levels of it, and they'll actually be able to rate how thermally efficient your building is and give it a performance rating. What they'll also do is that will also benchmark it against buildings of similar ages and similar types. So you can actually see how you sit within the average of the UK. So if you're, say, you come in a C rating, but the average is B, you can actually see what the difference is. And they'll give you ideas and tips of what you can do to actually improve it to get it to a B. And the reason for the EPC, again, is for landowners or building owners who don't necessarily operate the building, and particularly under the MEES regulation, it actually gives them advice on what they can do to try and actually increase their EPC rating, which means they can continue to rent the property, but also means that you can continue to, as you use the building, you're not hindered because the building hasn't been upgraded in lines with the requirements that we need. So if you are in a rented building, it will have an EPC. You can find these online on the government website. You just put your address in and it'll actually give you your EPC report. If you don't have one, then maybe speak to your building owner and see if you can get hold of it through there. If not, then request that they get one done for you. Okay, so very quickly, and again, I'm just literally going to touch on this. So when we look at building fabric, what we're actually looking at is how thermally proficient they are. And we do this through what we refer to as a U value. So that's the amount of energy that moves through a building, a fabric like a wall or a roof or windows, etc. And it's how much energy passes through that per square meter per temperature difference internally and externally. So obviously, the better the U value, the better, so the lower the U value, the better your building performs. Now, if we look on the right hand, so the top table here, so whenever you renovate a building, this is now the requirement that the building contractor has to meet whenever they renovate your building. And if you renovate more than 25% of the building fabric, you have to renovate the entire fabric. You can't just do partial ones. So whenever you look to upgrade or improve, this is what they will be aiming towards in terms of achieving. Now, historically, as this has been reviewed as part of building regulations, they've continually, required to improve it. So if you're not actually sure how well your building performs, you can look at historic, understand when your building was built, and then you can actually, through this graph here, you can actually see roughly how well your building would have performed at the time it was built as well. This is probably more for around, those who want to do building surveys, but I just thought it'd be useful to have a look at it to see what are we actually measuring, what is it that we're looking for, and then really what is it that, if we are going to make improvements, then this bit here is actually what we're going to be improving it to, and that they have to meet that. That's under the buildings regulations. So whenever you get your building improved, one of the key things to think about is, first of all, thermal bridging. So the challenge that we have whenever we add insulation, we can see the image in the top right hand corner, is that the insulation doesn't cover the full fabric. You get what we call thermal bridging, which means that the actual fabric of the building allows the cold to still enter through, or basically bypass the insulation. So we can see here in a heated camera, so insulation throughout the wall and the roof, but here where we actually have the join, there's no insulation there, and you can just see the cold actually coming through the building itself. The other side of it as well, which is really important, that as we start to wrap our buildings up, we actually change how the building breathes. So ventilation is absolutely fundamental. Whenever you're retrofitting your building or improving its insulation, you must consider the ventilation. Now, the standards that are being introduced at the moment actually require that. So whenever improvements are made, they have to consider ventilation. But it's really important that as we wrap and make buildings more airtight, we still have to maintain a level of airflow through the building in order to prevent damp and condensation. Now, what we're seeing more of now is heating recovery. So as you ventilate your building, you actually do it mechanically and put a heat recovery system within it, which means that as you pull the heat out of the building, you pass it through a heat exchanger, which means it then heats the air coming back into the building as well. Now, that is really for any organization that's really looking at completely retrofitting their entire building. That's the stage where I would say you want to look at that level of ventilation. But it's just something to be aware of, that if you do go for insulation, you do get a contractor in, it's just having these conversations. What are you doing to minimize thermal bridging, and what are you doing to maximize and ensure that we have the right ventilation through the building as well? In terms of payback, so adding insulation to roof systems is generally one of the shall we say, has the best paybacks. Heat tends to rise, gets trapped in the roof space. The better you insulate that, the less amount of heat you lose. Walls is typically second. I would say usually I would look at roof insulation first, then I would look at wall insulation, and then windows. Obviously, from a payback perspective, windows and doors offer very little payback. However, from a comfort level, if you have single glazing windows, they are freezing. So actually, if you do have single glazing, looking to upgrade them to double glazing, I would definitely recommend that. If you have double glazing and looking at triple glazing, I mean, that's a choice. It's extremely expensive. It won't save any money, or not a lot of it anyway. So that will be a choice that you need to make. So double glazing is usually okay. If you can go from single to triple, then obviously that's the best way to do it. But again, it's just that cost perspective that we just need to be aware of. Now, as I've mentioned, building performance is vital. The more efficient your building is, the better, but we just have to be aware that it is a challenge. And it might be a case of this is what we need to plan long term. So what can we change in the first 10 years? What do we need to change in the next 10 years? And how can we make sure that we budget and plan for that accordingly? So onto systems then. So the one I thought I'd start with is lighting. We all use lights. What I would say is if you haven't got LED, get LED. Fluorescent lighting, it's outdated technology now. In fact, they're actually stopping. Most fluorescent lighting is now being discontinued. You just can't buy the stuff anymore, and everything's being pushed towards LEDs. It is just significantly more efficient. Up to 50% is what we're generally seeing when we do LED installations. It really does cut your lighting bill in half. I say lighting bill, not energy bill. The other thing to really consider when you're doing lighting is the use of sensors. Now, obviously, working with staff and making sure they switch stuff off when they leave is absolutely fundamental. But to support that, there's two types of sensors. There's movement sensors, which rely on what they call passive infrared. We've seen this. You go into a bathroom, the lights turn on. You leave the bathroom, the lights turn off. Again, absolutely fantastic for places like this. If you have any rooms that have a low to moderate footfall, but people aren't in there for any sort of real length of time, then putting in movement sensors is absolutely fundamental, because it just means that when they leave the room, it just switches off. The second one, maybe a bit less well known, or certainly through conversations I've had, is light sensors or lux sensors. Now, we get these externally when the lights turn on when the sun goes down. Again, you can actually apply the same technology to a building. So if you have large glazed windows or a very bright office, we still find people turn lights on. What you can do is with lux sensors, and I would target where you put them. So maybe lights closer to the window, but by putting in light sensors, what you do is when you turn the lights on, it measures that the sensor measures how much light is in the area anyway, and only increases the artificial light to balance what is needed. So if you look on the right-hand side here, again, SIPC set a sort of a guidance as to how light certain areas need to be based on the activity that's undertaken. You would essentially put into the sensor how much light you want an area to have. And whenever you turn the lights on, it will only balance. If you get a lot of natural light and you only need, say, 5%, it will literally just turn the LED on by 5%. And again, as the light dims, it will increase the LED. So you get this constant balance between natural light and artificial light. Now, what's really important, and this is where switch off is important, is we've seen it in a few places where they put this technology in the summer, it's amazing, and everyone goes, yeah, great. But because none of the lights are on, they forget to turn them off. And then as the summer sun sets and the nighttime sets in, the lights turn on. So again, it's just making sure that you still have those behaviors in place to still be switching lights off, particularly when you start to use these types of technology. But again, the only efficient light is one that isn't switched on. Lighting is a very inefficient system. So using sensors and certainly switching to LEDs just helps to minimize the amount of energy that they consume. So really heating, as I said, heating is generally problematic for most businesses, and also a very large proportion of energy actually sits within the heating itself, particularly space heating and hot water as well. When looking at heating, it's really just important to think about, well, what is it that we're heating? How are we heating it? And is that the most efficient way? For any business that has a domestic hot water system, which is what DHW stands for, or district hot water system. So that's where you have a large water tank providing you with water. Unless you're using domestic volumes of water, so showers or anything like that, you don't need that much water. So what you can do is replace your large water tank for point of use water heaters. So these are small 10 to 15 litre tanks that sit underneath your sinks. You can put one in the bathroom, one in the kitchen. And what it means is that you can actually time the rooms independently. The systems operate separately, and you're not storing and heating very large quantities of water. You're only storing the water that you need. Now, if you're in a business or a building that actually the only hot water you use is in the kitchen and really for toilets aside, and only really for a little bit of washing up, or you have a dishwasher as an example, then even considering things like instant hot water taps, because then you're not storing any water. That's really where the energy is wasted in water, is when you store it, because you're constantly trying to keep that water to temperature, and it's constantly trying to lose the temperature. So if you can minimize that and reduce that, you actually reduce the amount of energy you put into that system. For that one. So in terms of heating, there's other things to consider. Now, these will depend on the type of business you have and the type of site you have. So if you have very high ceilings and you have a radiator system, as I said, as a convection system. So as the warm air rises, it sits in the roof space. Now we see this time and time again, old buildings or industrial buildings, we have very high roof space. It takes ages for the room to actually warm up. And it's not because the heating is working, it's because it's sat in the roof space. So these stratification fans or just ceiling fans are absolutely ideal for this. So inexpensive, anywhere between 60 to 100 pounds, space them out around the room. And what they do is they actually push the warm air down. So it actually circulates the air around the room. It means you reach a thermal comfort a lot quicker, and you actually save energy because you're not waiting for the heat and the trapped in the ceiling to actually come down as well. Probably more industrial, or anybody who has a pub or a cellar, air barriers. So air, the plastic air curtains that you get, absolutely fantastic at sort of bridging gaps. So we see this in industrial. We have a large delivery, a large roller door, and then you have where you have the delivery area, and then the room next to it has no door in it. So by actually putting in an air barrier, those curtains, it means you actually separate the delivery entrance from the rest of the building. So you can leave the roller door open as the truck comes in and delivers what it needs to, and as they leave, you can shut the roller door. But you've actually balanced the internal temperature by using that sort of air barrier. As we see just in the picture here, sorry. So this is actually in a pub, in a cellar. So what they have is where they actually drop the barrels down. This is just a wooden door, and it's just awful. In the summer, the heat just comes straight through that door. So by actually putting an air barrier, one of these curtains, in just this area here, actually helps separate the cellar area, which they're trying to keep at like 10 degrees, away from the warm area, which is just a wooden door. So again, it's really just looking at how are we using energy, where are we using it, and how these things can benefit. And that will be down to the business itself. The last one then is just so plant rooms. So where you have large plant rooms, large sort of boilers or areas, as we see here. And as we can see here, most of the pipes here don't have any lagging on them. There's no insulation on those pipes. So again, look at the plant room. And again, this is probably a larger site. If you're just an office, you shouldn't really need it too much, but it is just a case of actually just looking at your heating system. How many pipes do I have? Are those pipes insulated? And second to that, if you look down here, is valves don't tend to get insulated because they're just odd shapes, but you can buy jackets for them. So an exercise that was conducted by the Carbon Trust showed that actually for about £20, you can pay back within 5 years just by actually wrapping those valves up as well. So the idea is that you only want to lose the heat through the radiators. You don't want to lose it through the pipes as the heat travels from the boiler to the radiator. So insulating all of that is absolutely fundamental and will help to just, again, shave off those wasted bits of energy throughout your heating system. So I kind of mentioned the hot water already in terms of just thinking about, do you need a large tank or do you need point of use waters? But one I will mention, and this is something that is I think for most businesses is something to consider. So most heating systems are reactive, so they're based on the internal temperature. Weather compensation is actually proactive. So what it does is it measures the outside temperature and it adjusts the boiler temperature water flow. So if you're on a mild day, a mild winter's day, and we know UK winters can go from 12 degrees to 3 degrees in half an hour, sometimes it feels like it, but every day can be different in winter. So what this will do is it'll measure the outside temperature and it will change how hot it makes the water to ensure that it's only putting out the heat that the building needs. Because obviously the milder it is outside, the less heat you need inside. The colder it is outside, the more heat you need. So by using this compensation process, what it actually does is it allows the boiler to manage itself, and it will continually change how hot it makes the water. And that's when it actually makes the savings. So what we found is that with these sort of systems, you can save up to about 20% of the energy you're putting through your heating system by looking at a weather compensation or a load compensation process. Now, that's built into the control. So you will have to look at a new control system. So it may depend on the age of your boiler. But if you can get it done, it's something I definitely recommend for a lot of businesses to sort of definitely look at and hopefully if you can actually get it installed. It just makes managing it so much easier. Okay, so what we tend to find, so traditionally, most heating systems are convection, so they warm the air. Now, the problem with air is that it's not a great conductor of heat. It also wants to escape to cold air as quick as it can. So this is really where, building fabric is so important. So if you have single glazing windows, you'll just feel cold air running through it. It's because the warm air is just trying to get out to the cold as quick as it can. Now, as I mentioned, not all rooms require the same type of heat and not all rooms can actually be heated in the same way. So when we find really poorly insulated buildings or areas where have a high throughput of traffic, so a reception area as an example, we've often seen, secondary systems or just heating ramped up to like 25 or 26 just to try and keep the receptionist warm. One technology, again, it's been around for a number of years, but people tend to maybe recognize this of infrared more than anything else. The sort of really bright red hot quartz that burns your head and left you with cold feet. The technology has moved on from there, and we actually now have what they call panels. So these are much better. They also have different types of infrared panels for different types of scenarios. So infrared works like sunlight. So it's not bothered too much about the air temperature. It warms thermal mass directly. So it warms like the sun does. So like, when you're in a cold winter's day, you stand in the sun, you feel lovely. It's that kind of effect that you basically get from these. Now, the idea with it is that rather than trying to heat the air, which is just escaping out the door continuously every time someone opens it, you're actually heating the person directly. So this is really ideal for secondary heat sources, particularly if you have maybe like one person who's always cold and they always have an electric convection heater with them. Ditch the electric convection heater and look at infrared instead, because it'll warm them, not the rest of the room as well. They're also really useful for buildings with high ceilings. So if you have a hall or, we work with some community groups and we find that, they have really, really sort of high halls, and trying to heat all that space is just a waste of energy. So infrared is really ideal for those sort of spaces as well. You'd be looking more at these sort of panels, the medium wave ones, they're ideal for sort of high ceilings. And again, it just warms the room directly rather than trying to warm all of the air around it. The other thing to consider as well is that for buildings that need dynamic heat, so I'm talking, again, probably more community or rooms that only need heat for like an hour and then don't need to be heated the rest of the day, infrared, again, is really ideal at that. It warms really quickly. It doesn't require to heat the room first. So you can turn the heating system on, it warms the people while they're in there, and as soon as they leave, it shuts off and you've not wasted any energy. So in terms of heat, so coming on to, I guess, the elephant in the room at the moment with most heat and what people tend to be looking at the moment is heat pumps. So, we've seen a very big push on these, and heat pumps are a very useful technology. Absolutely. They're very efficient and a great technology to consider, but you just need to be aware of their limitations. They are a low temperature heating system. Now, the average boiler puts out heat at about 70 degrees, thereabouts. An air source or a ground source heat pump puts out its heat at around about 40 degrees. So it's almost half. Now, if your building is well insulated, then that's fine. A low temperature heating system will work fairly well within that. If you have a porous building, it will be limited. It might not necessarily heat as much as you'd like it to, and you may need to consider a secondary system. Now, the idea being that when you actually put a heat pump in, you actually want to size it to about 60 to 80% of the heat load, which means that you want the heat pump to run all winter and not have the spike of up and down where you're trying to get 100% of the heat load. So you just want it to provide the baseline. Now, again, if your building's well insulated, that baseline will pretty much cover 90% of your heating season. And all you really have to then make up is those really, really, really cold extreme days is where you want maybe a secondary system to kick in. So there is an option to look at what they call a hybrid system, where you have your heat pump provide 80% of your heat load, and then you have a secondary system just to top up that final little bit that you need on those really cold days. Now that can be a gas boiler, a very, very small gas boiler, or maybe another electrical system like infrared or something else. But the idea is that you change your entire heating dynamic to a heat pump, which provides you the base load, and then use something else to sort of just cover the really extremely cold days. What that will then do is overall, your heating system will become a lot more efficient, and you'll also kind of almost, cut out the problem you have with most low temperature heating systems. The second thing to consider is that hot water needs to be heated at 60 degrees. Now, a heat pump really wants to work at 40 degrees. So if you are going to switch to a heat pump, we would generally recommend that you then separate out your water system. And that's what we would say, look at the point of use water heaters, because you don't want to, put all the money into making this thing really efficient, but now it has to try heat water to 60 degrees, and you kind of lose that efficiency throughout the entire system. Whereas if you separate it, you allow your heat pump to operate as it needs to, and your hot water system to operate as it needs to, and you save the efficiencies in the two actually working the way that they need to and what they do best as well. Now, the final thing to consider is that a heat pump isn't plug and play. You can't just put it into your existing system. You have to adapt it, and that's unfortunately where a lot of the cost in this comes in. There's three methods to deliver the heat. The first is through underfloor heating. So if you already have underfloor heating, then a heat pump is something that could be considered. Underfloor heating is very efficient in the sense that it heats the entire floor, and therefore you have like your entire room becomes a heater. So really good and amazing at low temperature heating, because you have a mass of thermal, a load of thermal mass providing the heat. However, it only really works in places that need long continuous heat. So if you're an office of 9 to 5, great. If you're in a community type building where you only have periods, maybe an hour here, 2 hours there, an hour later on, it doesn't really work that well. It doesn't heat and cool down very quickly. The second is through radiator systems. Now, because it's low temperature, you have to increase the size of your radiators. So you want to still put the same amount of heat out, but because you're putting in a lower temperature, you just need to increase the radiator size. So you want to increase it from about, I think it's about 40 to 50%. So that just be increasing the number of radiators you have, or just increasing the size of the radiators, or actually looking at specialized radiators built for heat pumps. But you have to change your radiators in order to have a heat pump installed. So again, that's just something to consider when you're looking at the cost of these things. The final option, and we tend to see this with most buildings, and to be fair, we tend to recommend this for most buildings, is to look at an air conditioning type system instead. Air doesn't need to be heated. You're looking to only heat the air to maybe 20 degrees. So it actually becomes quite an efficient way of using a heat pump. So an air conditioning system uses a heat pump to produce heat into a building. It can also be reversed to actually take heat out of the building. So you do allow the system to actually now cool and heat the building. However, that's really where the caveat sits, is that if you are going to use it for cooling, you are actually increasing the overall energy consumption of the system. So again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, particularly on the really hot days, but it does just need to be factored in. It'll still be more efficient overall, but we always say try and minimize the cooling as much as possible, and really just try and keep it for heating as best you can. Okay, so I'm just conscious of time, so we'll just carry on. So renewables is the next one. So what I thought we'd look at is wind. So as I mentioned before, wind is you know, the UK has a lot of wind. In fact, it's one of the windiest places in Europe. You know, the joys being the island that we are. However, capturing that wind is quite expensive. Now, what we tend to say for most buildings is rooftop systems are not great. Not to say not to consider them, but there's not very many places, particularly in urban environments, where a rooftop system will actually generate enough energy given the cost of installation. So what you really want to do with wind is you want to get it on a pole and you want to get it up into the sky. However, that then means that it costs an exorbitant amount of money. So we did a comparison. A 10 kilowatt solar PV system would generate about 9,000 kilowatt hours thereabouts. So it's about 1 for 1. For every £1,000 you spend on installing it, you get a kilowatt of energy out of it. For the same system in wind, it would generate around 22,000 kilowatt hours. So again, like I say, as a system, it produces energy, just amazing amounts of energy, but would probably cost you around £40,000. So that works out around 1 to 2. So for every £1,000 you're spending, so for every kilowatt you're getting, you're actually spending £2 essentially. So it is just a lot more expensive, but you will get more energy out of it. So I'm not to say it's not to be considered, but it does need to be considered in the right places just because of the high expense of it. So if you're in a more rural location, or you have a bit more space, and as we see in the image here, you can get it above the general turbulence, so you're not surrounded by high trees or high buildings, then that's probably something to consider. However, as we can see, a 10 kilowatt system can provide 20,000 kilowatt hours of energy all the time, that is. So that's also when you're not operating. So the other side of it as well is, can you use all of the energy that you generate? Because again, that's really where you make the money out of these things. If you're generating all this energy, but only using 20% of it, you're just not going to get the paybacks that you want from it. So that's where you probably want to look at maybe like solar storage, so battery storage, we'll come on to a bit later on. But again, these systems just have to be thought about. How is it going to work? What does it generate? How can we use that? And what else do we need? And again, I mention that because if you put battery storage in, you just increase the cost of installation quite a lot more as well. So The one that we all know, solar panels, you know, it's been around for many years. It's a proven technology. It works really well. It's actually, the costs are so low on it now. We see paybacks within 6 to 10 years. I mean, for most businesses, it's about 7 years. And there are opportunities for power purchase agreements. So this will be installation companies which will actually finance the installation for you. The way a power purchase agreement works is they install all of it. They manage all of it. You don't have to pay anything towards it, and they sell you back the energy at a reduced rate. They tend to run that for about 10 years, depending on the contract, 10 to 12 years. At the end of that contract, you actually take on the solar panels, so you get the last end of its life. So it can work quite well for, you know, particularly if you don't have that much upfront cost. It does actually extend the payback. We found that with a PPA, the payback actually works out to around 14, 15 years. So again, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but you'll actually get a better payback if you install the system yourself directly and generate the savings and capitalize on the savings yourself straight away. Just the one thing I want to mention about solar PV particularly is that you want to try and use as much of the energy generated as possible. While you can now export to the grid, you'll only get about 5 pence per kilowatt. So that's the current rate that you get for exporting energy into the grid. Whereas nowadays energy costs, so I should change this. Nowadays the slide, I've seen businesses up to 26, 27 pence per kilowatt now. So if you can actually consume as much of that energy as possible, that's really the way to maximize savings. Now, that isn't to say that you can't just, you know, put solar PV everywhere and completely oversize it, but you do really want to think about how your business performs and how large a system do you actually want to put on. The other thing as well is it's a 25-year investment. So, you know, solar PV will operate for 25 years comfortably, which means that when you're sizing your system, you do want to think about what changes you're going to make to the building. So if you're going to start, you know, making massive efficiency improvements, you're actually going to reduce your energy consumption. So taking that into account, you just need to plan. But on the flip side, if any of you have fleets and want to electrify your fleet or want to encourage staff to electrify their fleet, then if you start putting EV chargers on site, you're actually going to increase your energy demand. So again, it's because it's 25 years, you do just have to really think about how you plan it. Now, the key thing is that you don't have to do one installation. You can do one installation now, one in 5 years, one in 10 years, you know, just to adapt to the size of the building. But once it's on, you can't reduce it. So start small and grow is probably the recommendation I would make with most of these systems. Yeah, just last point. So again, time. As we can see here, so this is a building that's actually heated electrically. And we can see the stark difference between the solar performance, amazing in the summer, and the winter performance. Now, I'll caveat to say that their heating system was awful, and their demand, we could probably half that through efficiencies, but you still see that the winter performance of solar PV just isn't. So if you're going to change your heating to electric heating, just be aware that solar PV won't necessarily help with that too much. It really is useful in the summer. One other thing to consider for those who have hot water and need hot water is to potentially look at solar thermal. So this is, again, it works fantastic. It's amazing on domestic properties. You know, if you haven't got solar thermal, you know, I would consider looking at it at home. But for any business that needs to use hot water, particularly all year round, then solar thermal is something to consider. It can provide about 40% of the annual hot water load. So again, it can almost half your sort of energy bill around water. You know, ideally, it is best for businesses that need water all year round. But given the rising energy costs, for example, if you're a sports club or have any sort of, you know, have showers which are just used seasonally for like football, that kind of thing, then it's still actually worth considering, because the paybacks now, given the energy costs, actually make this a more viable technology than it did previously. So again, just something to consider. And then the last one, battery storage. Now, the slides just basically explain what batteries are, but when looking at battery storage, you just need to plan it carefully. It works really well in a domestic setting with solar PV, where you have low daytime energy, but high generation. And then you have high nighttime consumption with no generation. So you're generating all this energy that you're not using, so you throw it into a battery, and then when you come back to your house at nighttime, when you're then now using all the but you're not generating energy, the battery makes up the difference. So that's the way to consider it when you're looking at it from a business perspective as well. How much are we generating in excess? And if we capture that, when will we have an opportunity to use it? And that's really the fundamental, because if you look at, we looked at the winter heating. Now, while you get all that extra, energy in summer, you can't capture all of that and leave it to the winter, because that's not the way a battery storage system works. You'll have used all that energy within the first month and then not do anything to actually cover the rest of winter. So they are really ideal for businesses who have high generation or low daytime usage with higher nighttime usage. So again, it's just really making sure that you plan when and where to put a battery system in. However, one thing to consider is if you are going to be switching to an electric fleet and you're going to be putting EV chargers in, you're going to be increasing the load that you put on your energy demand. Now, load is basically how much energy you pull out of the grid. Battery storage or battery systems are ideal at leveling that out. So if you are going to be putting in an electric fleet, considering a battery storage to sit in the background, that when you plug all your vehicles in, the battery can actually take that load, so you're not pulling all that energy straight out of the grid. It just helps manage your overall energy consumption. If you can charge those batteries with solar PV, then fantastic. If not, what we'd recommend is you charge it at night when you have your lowest rates, that when you're plugging your vehicles in, you're actually using the energy. So you're not drawing energy at its highest rate, you're drawing it when it's at its lowest rate. So again, it does depend on the business and how you're using it. In industry, it's fantastic for large industrial units that are really close to capacity and therefore want to try and draw the least amount of energy they can off the grid. And then finally, just on battery systems, they last 10 to 12 years. So if you are installing this with solar PV or wind, they're 20 to 25-year projects. So you're going to have to buy it twice. So when you're costing it, you just need to take into account that the battery will only last half the time the solar PV lasts. So you're going to have to fund that twice. So when you look at lifetime costs, it's just being aware of that. Okay, sorry, like I said, absolutely rambled through that. Hopefully that was useful to everybody. The last thing I just wanted to do was just quickly around actions. So as I said at the beginning of it, you really just need to understand, how you're using your energy, why you're using it the way you are, and where are there opportunities to make differences. Now, improve the behaviors first, and then throw the technology in to support that. That's absolutely fundamental. When you're building your action plans, it's taking all of that into consideration. So what are the problematic areas that you have? What is the technology that will help you do that? And then what is it going to cost you? And when is it that you can plan that in? So when you're doing your action plans, really target quick wins, staff behaviors, control systems, things that are low cost, high impact. Then think about technology, think about when you need to put the technology in, think about how much the technology costs. So you would do it as sort of a basic business case for it, and then plan in when you're going to add that technology. What's really important is when you add technology in, you must adapt the behaviors to fit the technology as well. So sometimes with certain systems, they may need to be handled in a slightly different way, which just means that you need to make sure that staff are aware how to use it and that your behaviors are always matching the technology you have within the building as well. It's really, again, focus on key areas of buildings. If you can improve building fabric, then definitely something to consider, but that may be a longer term plan. And then anything that uses fuels, if you can switch it to electric, obviously then as an efficiency point of view, that's better. But, again, it's just making sure that controlling actions. So how staff are using things are really targeted first, with minimizing actions to sort of back that up and support that. So I won't go into too much detail. We've covered most of this within the actual presentation, but these are some of the frequently introduced actions that we see across most businesses. And as you can see, most of these actually cover what we do already. One action I would recommend that we haven't really covered is an asset list. So when you're actually starting to look at your building and look at your business, build an asset list. What technology do you have on site? How much energy is it consuming? And how is it being used? Because that will give you that first step to thinking, well, where is it that we can change our technology and change our behaviors to make improvements as well. Can't think of anything else in there as well. So again, zone of control, weather compensation, definitely things to think about as well. Finally, just in terms of grant funding, so there is funding available. Sometimes it's not the easiest things to find. Different funding schemes will have different funding parameters in terms of what they will fund. So some schemes may fund installation, some won't. Some may fund a more efficient boiler, some won't. So it's just really being aware of what they will fund and whether that meets your need. In terms of funding, if you do find most funding at the moment, although this is changing, is EU funded, which means you have to therefore be eligible to apply for it. And this is just some guidance in terms of the eligibility of it. Again, the slides will be available, so I won't go into too much detail now. But what I will mention is that we do have a grant fund at Eastern New Energy. It's been delivered through the University of East London. We offer up to 25% intervention rates, and the minimum grant is £1,000. So your project size, your minimum project size has to be £4,000 and upwards. We're actually due to complete this year. So if you do have any projects underway, or you're thinking of anything, contact us as soon as possible. We can have a conversation. We do also offer site visits as well. So we can actually come to site and do an assessment of your building to understand where there's opportunities. And then if there's anything we identify, you can apply for funding as well. However, speak to your local authority, speak to your growth hub. They tend to be aware of a lot of funding that's going on. And we also know that some funds that are, so if you're near a landfill site or a large energy installation, they often have funds set up to support local businesses. So it's worth actually, if you are near any of these businesses, worth going online and just looking if they have one of these prosperity funds and actually seeing if you can access that funding as well. I know there are a few around Cambridgeshire, so it's definitely worth looking at to see if you fall within their catchment area. Okay.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions, I'm conscious that it is 1 o'clock, but we do have one question. We have, how do you, oh, sorry, if I can find it. How do you get solar panels changed from selling to grid to being able to use your own energy?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
How do you get solar panels changed from selling to grid to being able to use your own energy?
How do you get solar panels to change from
selling to the grid to being able to use your own energy?
Oh, okay. So when a solar panel is installed, there will be what they call a sort of a generation meter attached to the site itself. Now, the way the generation meter works is it will automatically, if you're pulling energy through the meter, it will actually send the solar energy into the building. As soon as you don't pull as much energy from that meter as you need to, it'll then send it into the grid. So the meter will actually manage all of that for you. So you don't have to necessarily worry about switching a solar panel from one to the other. When they're installed, they should have, at least if they're certified systems, they'll actually have that meter that will manage that for you. And what it does is it continually measures how much energy you pull and will actually meet that need with the solar PV. And anything you're not using, it'll then send the excess back into the grid for you. So it will do that automatically.
Fantastic. It is 1 o'clock, so if anyone doesn't have any questions right now, I can put David's email in, we'll forward out, and I'll put it in the chat as well, and then you can send any more further in-depth questions to David. I know that we've got Gemma Little, who just wants to say a couple of words about the council and how they can support you, so I'll just pop her on.
Hi everyone, just very quickly, because I'm conscious of the time. Really fascinating stuff from David, and as he said, as a council we are here to help as much as we can. One of the things that we'll circulate via Jasmine is a guide that Catherine in our climate change team has put together on the support that's available for businesses on carbon reduction, free support and free advice. So hopefully that will be a useful document for you, and if there is anything else we can help you with, it may just be signposting you to other sources of support, but we're here to do that, and I'll do my best to help you if you want to get in touch after the meeting.
Thank you so much, Gemma. So I've put Gemma's email in the chat there for you, as long with David's email for you there. Thank you so much, David, for your really interesting chat today and talk. So much information, so we're definitely sending that all out so you all can read through that in your own time. I'm also just going to pop a quick feedback form. If people would love to share their feedback about the event today, we'd be very grateful. And if you want to find anything more about Cambridge Carbon Footprint and the Charter, we've got our website there. And all I can really say is thank you so much for David speaking, and thank you for everyone for attending, and please do get in touch with any questions.